gathering shellfish at low tide, ankle-deep in water. The ground seemed to shift, sand swirling in the shallows. Looking down to see a massive black and white form, realization dawned. The orca had beached itself intentionally. Its massive jaws opened, lunging forward with incredible speed. In nature's domain, nowhere was truly safe. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Jack Thornton squinted at the horizon, his weathered hands gripping the wheel of his trusty fishing boat. The Sea Whisper. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the calm waters of the Alaskan coast. But Jack knew better than to trust the deceptive tranquility. At 60 years old, he'd spent more time on these waters than on land, and he could smell the change in the air. Fog's rolling in early tonight, he muttered to himself, a habit born from years of solitary voyages. Jack had left Juneau that morning, eager to get in one last fishing trip before the season ended. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 2 years ago, and these solo excursions had become his way of finding peace. As he steered the Sea Whisper further from the coast, Jack's mind wandered to the weather forecast he'd checked before leaving port. Clear skies, they'd said. But out here, Mother Nature played by her own rules. The first tendrils of mist crept across the bow, wispy fingers reaching out to embrace the boat. Jack frowned, reaching for the radio. Juneau Harbor Master, this is the Sea Whisper. You copy? Static crackled for a moment before a voice responded. Sea Whisper, this is Juneau Harbor. Go ahead. Visibility's dropping fast out here. Any weather alerts I should know about? There was a pause before the harbor master replied. Negative, Sea Whisper. All clear on our end. Where's your position? Jack rattled off his coordinates, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Something wasn't right. The fog was thickening rapidly, far quicker than he'd ever seen before. Roger that, Sea Whisper. We'll keep an eye on things. Safe fishing. Thanks, Harbor Master. Sea Whisper out. Jack replaced the radio handset, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd planned to go further out, but with this fog, better. Drop anchor here, he decided, moving to secure the boat. As night fell, the fog became an impenetrable wall of gray. Jack sat in the cabin, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands as he stared out at the nothingness beyond the windows. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Hours ticked by, and Jack found himself drifting off, lulled by the boat's familiar rhythm. Just as his eyes began to close, a sharp noise jolted him, awake. He sat up straight, ears straining. There it was again, a sound unlike anything he'd heard before. It was a high-pitched whistle followed by a deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the hull of the boat. What in the world? Jack murmured, moving to the deck. The fog swirled around him, so thick he could barely see his own hand, in front of his face. He gripped the railing, peering into the gloom. Another call echoed through the night, closer this time. Jack's heart began to race. In all his years on these waters, he'd never encountered anything like this. It wasn't the sound of any whale he knew, and it certainly wasn't man-made. Suddenly, something large moved in the water beside the boat. Jack caught a glimpse of a sleek, dark shape just beneath the surface before it disappeared. Hello? He called out, his voice swallowed by the fog. Is someone there? The only answer was another haunting call, this time from the other side of the boat. Jack spun around, his eyes wide as he tried to penetrate the mist. He was surrounded, he realized, by unseen creatures circling his vessel. Without warning, a massive force struck the Sea Whisper from below. The impact sent Jack sprawling across the deck, his head narrowly missing the winch as he fell. The boat rocked violently, water sloshing over the sides. Jesus Christ, Jack gasped, scrambling to his feet. He rushed to the cabin, his hands shaking as he reached for the radio. Mayday, Mayday, this is the Sea Whisper. I'm under attack. Only static answered his call. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the radio was dead. Another blow rocked the boat, and he heard the sickening sound of splintering wood. Grabbing a flashlight, Jack hurried back to the deck. He swept the beam, across the waters, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of a massive dorsal fin cutting through the waves. It was gone in an instant, leaving Jack to question if he'd truly seen it. The attacks continued throughout the night, each impact more forceful than the last. Jack worked tirelessly, trying to patch the growing holes in the hull, but it was a losing battle. As the first light of dawn began to penetrate the fog, he knew the Sea Whisper was living on borrowed time. Exhausted and terrified, Jack slumped against the cabin wall, his mind racing. What were these creatures? Why were they attacking his boat? In all his years fishing these waters, he'd never experienced anything like this. As the fog began to lift, revealing the gray morning light, Jack's questions were answered in the most horrifying way possible. There, surrounding his crippled boat, was a pod of orcas. Their black and white bodies gleamed in the weak sunlight, dorsal fins slicing through the water as they circled. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Orcas were a common sight in these waters, but they'd never shown aggression towards boats before. He'd always admired their intelligence and grace from a distance. Now, as he met the eye of the largest orca, he saw something that chilled him to his core: purpose. These weren't mindless attacks. The orcas were methodically destroying his boat, and Jack realized with growing horror that he was their target. As if sensing his understanding, the lead orca let out a haunting call. The others responded in kind, their vocalizations filling the air with an otherworldly chorus. Then, as one, they dove beneath the surface. Jack held his breath, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for the next attack. The silence stretched on, broken only by the creaking of the Sea Whisper's damaged hull. Just as he began to hope they'd left, a tremendous force struck the boat from below. The impact lifted the Sea Whisper partially out of the water before it came crashing back down. Jack was thrown across the deck, his head striking the railing with a sickening crack. Dazed and bleeding, Jack struggled to his feet. Water was pouring in faster now, and he knew the boat wouldn't stay afloat much longer. With shaking hands, he managed to inflate the small life raft he kept for emergencies. As he prepared to abandon ship, Jack took one last look at the Sea Whisper. This boat had been his home, his livelihood, and his escape. Now it would become his tomb if he didn't act fast. With a heavy heart, Jack lowered himself into the life raft. The orcas surfaced again, their dorsal fins forming a menacing circle around him. As the Sea Whisper gurgled its last and slipped beneath the waves, Jack found himself alone and exposed, adrift in a sea of killers. The true horror of his situation crashed over him like a wave. This was no longer a fishing trip, gone wrong. It was a fight for survival against one of nature's most intelligent and powerful predators. And as the largest orca swam closer, its eye fixed on Jack with chilling intelligence, he realized that the night of terror had been just the beginning. The first rays of dawn pierced through the dissipating fog, casting an eerie glow across the choppy waters. Jack Thornton, his clothes drenched and his body shivering, clung to the small life raft that had become his only sanctuary. The events of the night before seemed like a distant nightmare, but the absence of his beloved Sea Whisper was a stark reminder of the reality he now faced. As visibility improved, Jack's eyes widened in horror. The damage to his boat was far worse than he had imagined in the darkness. Large sections of the hull were visible above the waterline, jagged holes torn through the sturdy wood like it was paper. The Sea Whisper listed heavily to one side, taking on water at an alarming rate. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, his voice hoarse from shouting throughout the night. He paddled the raft closer, desperate to salvage anything he could from the sinking vessel. As he approached, a sleek black dorsal fin cut through the water nearby, causing him to recoil instinctively. The orca surfaced, its massive body dwarfing Jack's tiny raft. Its intelligent eye seemed to study him with an unsettling intensity. Jack held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he locked gazes with the apex predator. After what felt like an eternity, the orca sank back into the depths, leaving Jack alone with his failing boat. With trembling hands, Jack managed to secure the raft to the Sea Whisper's railing. He climbed aboard, wincing at the groaning of stressed wood beneath his feet. Water sloshed around his ankles as he made his way to the cabin, searching for anything that might aid his survival. "Come on, where are you?" he muttered, rummaging through waterlogged supplies. His fingers closed around the handle of his emergency kit, and he let out a sigh of relief. At least he'd have some basic supplies. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell on a framed photo of Margaret, miraculously untouched by the water. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, tucking it safely into the kit. A loud crack echoed through the air, and the boat lurched violently. Jack stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing on the tilting deck. He scrambled back to the raft, knowing his time was running out. Just as he prepared to cast off, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. There, circling his sinking boat, was not one orca, but an entire pod. He counted at least 6 of the massive creatures, their dorsal fins slicing through the water with ominous grace. Jack had seen orcas before in these waters, had even admired their beauty from a distance. But now, as he watched them systematically destroy his livelihood, he felt nothing but terror. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" As if in response, the largest orca, the one he'd locked eyes with earlier, surged forward, ramming into the Sea Whisper with incredible force. The impact sent shockwaves through the boat, and Jack watched in despair as his beloved vessel began its final descent into the frigid Alaskan waters. Realizing he had no choice, Jack cut the line tethering him to the Sea Whisper. He began paddling frantically, desperate to put some distance between himself and the aggressive pod. But the orcas seemed to have other plans. They moved with coordinated precision, herding Jack away from the shoreline and into open waters. "Help!" Jack shouted, his voice carrying across the empty expanse. "Somebody help me!" But he knew it was futile. He was miles from the nearest shipping lane, and his radio was now at the bottom of the ocean, along with his boat. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of his situation sank in. Jack was alone, adrift in a tiny raft, surrounded by a pod of uncharacteristically aggressive orcas. His body ached from the night's ordeals, and the chill of the Alaskan waters was seeping into his bones. "Think, Jack, think," he muttered to himself, trying to recall everything he knew about orca behavior. They were intelligent, social creatures, known for their complex hunting strategies. But attacks on humans were incredibly rare, almost unheard of in the wild. So why were these orcas so focused on him? As he pondered this, one of the smaller orcas broke from the group, swimming closer to his raft. Jack held his breath, watching as the creature's eye rose above the waterline, studying him with unnerving intelligence. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw curiosity in that gaze, maybe even a flicker of empathy. But then the orca dived, its powerful tail sending a spray of icy water over Jack. "Jesus!" Jack gasped, shivering as the cold water soaked him anew. He fumbled with the emergency kit, pulling out a space blanket and wrapping it around his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it provided a small barrier against the biting cold. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack's hopes for rescue began to dwindle. He knew the Coast Guard would eventually notice he hadn't returned to port, but how long would that take? And even if they did send out a search party, how would they find him in this vast expanse of ocean? The orcas continued their patrol, always keeping Jack in the center of their formation. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something, but what? As the hours crawled by, Jack's mind began to wander, exhaustion and fear blurring the lines of reality. "Margaret," he whispered, clutching the framed photo to his chest. "I'm sorry, love. I should have listened to you. Should have sold the boat when you asked me to." Tears mixed with the salt spray on his cheeks as he remembered their last conversation before her passing. She had worried about him going out alone, had begged him to retire from fishing, but he had been stubborn, unable to let go of the only life he'd ever known. A sudden splash jolted Jack from his memories. The large orca, the one he'd come to think of as the leader, had breached near his raft, sending a wave of water crashing over him. As Jack sputtered and coughed, he noticed something clutched in the orca's mouth. A piece of the Sea Whisper's hull, unmistakable with its faded blue paint. The orca dropped the piece of wood near the raft, its eye never leaving Jack. Was this a trophy? A warning? Jack couldn't be sure, but the message was clear. His fate was in their hands now. As the day wore on, Jack's situation grew more dire. The sun, normally a welcome sight, now beat down mercilessly, baking him in his small raft. His supplies of fresh water were limited, and he knew dehydration would soon become a serious threat. Yet every time he thought about trying to paddle towards land, the orcas would close ranks, herding him back to open water. "What do you want? From me?" Jack shouted, his frustration and fear finally boiling over. Just get it over with. But the orcas remained maddeningly patient, content to circle and wait. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jack felt the last vestiges of hope slip away. He was no longer a seasoned fisherman, master of his domain. Here, adrift in this unforgiving sea, he was prey, pure and simple. As darkness fell once more, bringing with it the bone-chilling cold of an Alaskan night, Jack huddled in his raft, clutching Margaret's photo like a lifeline. The orca's dorsal fins continued to slice through the water around him, silent sentinels, in the gathering gloom. "I don't know if I'm going to make it through this one, Maggie," Jack whispered to the photo, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves. "But I promise, if I do, I'm hanging up my captain's hat for good." As if in response to his words, a haunting call echoed across the water, the unmistakable vocalization of an orca. It was joined by another, then another, until the night air was filled with their eerie song. Jack listened, transfixed despite his fear, as the orcas communicated in their complex language. In that moment, surrounded by the very creatures that had destroyed his life yet seemed reluctant to take it, Jack Thornton felt smaller and more insignificant than he ever had before. He was a speck in the vast ocean, at the mercy of forces he couldn't begin to understand. As the orca's song washed over him, Jack closed his eyes, wondering what the dawn would bring. Rescue, or the final act of this terrifying ordeal. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Jack Thornton stirred in his small raft, his body stiff and aching from the long, cold night. As consciousness fully returned, so did the stark reality of his situation. The gentle lapping of waves against the raft was punctuated by the occasional exhale of the orcas that still surrounded him. Jack sat up slowly, wincing at the protest of his muscles. His throat was parched, his lips cracked from dehydration. With trembling hands, he reached for the emergency kit, retrieving one of the precious few water bottles he had managed to salvage. He took a small sip, rationing the life-giving liquid. "Okay, Jack," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. "Think, there's got to be a way out of this." As he scanned his surroundings, Jack's heart sank. The Sea Whisper was nowhere to be seen, having slipped beneath the waves during the night. All that remained of his beloved boat were a few pieces of debris floating nearby. The orcas continued their vigil, their dorsal fins cutting through the water in a mesmerizing, terrifying dance. Jack's eyes fell on the largest orca, the one he had come to think of as the leader. It surfaced nearby, its intelligent eye seeming to study him. In that gaze, Jack saw something that chilled him to his core. Not mindless aggression, but purpose. "What do you want?" Jack found himself asking, knowing he wouldn't get an answer but unable to contain the question. The orca simply dove back under the surface, leaving Jack alone with his mounting dread. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack began to take stock of his supplies. The emergency kit contained a few more bottles of water, some energy bars, a first aid kit, a small fishing line, and a flare gun with 3 flares. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to keep him alive until rescue came. If rescue came. The sound of rushing water made Jack look up sharply. To his horror, he saw that his raft had developed a slow leak. A small but steady stream of water was trickling in through a tear in the bottom. No, Jack muttered, frantically, searching the kit for anything he could use to patch the hole. His fingers closed around a small tube of sealant, and he let out a sigh of relief. But as he moved to apply it, a sudden impact rocked the raft. One of the smaller orcas had struck the raft from below, nearly capsizing it. Jack clung to the sides, his heart pounding as water sloshed around him. The orca surfaced nearby, its eye fixed on Jack with what he could have sworn was curiosity. "Back off," Jack shouted, his fear turning to anger. "Haven't you done enough?" The orca responded with a high-pitched whistle before diving back under the waves. Jack wasted no time in applying the sealant to the leak, his hands shaking with adrenaline. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it would have to do. As the day wore on, the sun beat down mercilessly on Jack's exposed skin. He could feel it burning, adding to his misery. The orcas continued their patrol, always keeping him at the center of their formation. Every so often, one would approach the raft, sometimes nudging it gently, other times swimming alongside as if studying Jack. "I don't understand," Jack said aloud, his voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. "Why don't you just get it over with?" As if in response, the lead orca breached nearby, its massive body clearing the water in a spectacular display of power. It crashed back down, sending a wave over Jack and his raft. As he sputtered and wiped the salt water from his eyes, Jack noticed something clutched in the orca's mouth, a piece of wood from the sea whisper. The orca dropped the wood near the raft before diving again. Jack stared at the debris, a lump forming in his throat. It was a piece of the cabin, the faded blue paint still visible. He reached out and grabbed it, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. "I'm sorry, old girl," he whispered, tears mixing with the salt water on his cheeks. "I should have taken better care of you." As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Jack's situation grew more desperate. The patch on the raft was holding, but barely. He was down to his last bottle of water, and the energy bars were doing little to stave off the gnawing hunger in his stomach. Worse, he could feel his mind starting to slip, exhaustion and fear taking their toll. "Margaret," he mumbled, pulling out the photo of his late wife. "I wish you were here. You'd know what to do." The photo stared back at him, Margaret's smile as radiant as ever. Jack found himself talking to it, recounting their life together, apologizing for not listening to her concerns about his solo fishing trips. As night fell, bringing with it the bone-chilling cold of the Alaskan waters, Jack's ramblings became more disjointed. "Remember our first date, Maggie?" he slurred, his eyes unfocused. "That little diner in Juneau. You ordered the halibut. Said it was the best you'd ever had. I knew right then I was going to marry you." A sudden splash jolted Jack from his reverie. The lead orca had surfaced right next to the raft, so close Jack could have reached out and touched it. Its eye, intelligent, and somehow ancient, seemed to bore into Jack's very soul. For a long moment they stared at each other, man and beast, stranded in the vast emptiness of the ocean. Then, slowly, deliberately, the orca opened its mouth. Jack recoiled, certain that this was finally the end. But instead of attacking, the orca simply released something into the water next to the raft. Jack blinked in disbelief. Floating there was a fish, a large salmon, still wriggling weakly. He looked from the fish to the orca, confusion written across his face. "Are you feeding me?" he asked incredulously. The orca made a low rumbling sound before diving back under the waves. Jack stared at the fish, his mind racing. Was this a peace offering? A way to keep him alive? Or something more sinister? Hunger eventually won out over caution. Jack retrieved the fish, using his small emergency knife to clean and cut it. As he ate the raw flesh, grateful for the sustenance despite its unpleasant texture, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The night wore on, punctuated by the occasional calls of the orcas. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with images of Margaret, the sea whisper, and vast, dark shapes moving beneath the waves. He was jolted awake by another impact to the raft. Water was pouring in faster now, the patch having given way. Jack scrambled to reapply the sealant, but his movements were sluggish, his coordination shot from exhaustion and exposure. "No, please," he begged, his voice a ragged whisper. "Not like this." As he struggled to save his tiny sanctuary, Jack became aware of a change in the orca's behavior. They were more active now, their calls more frequent and urgent. He looked up, squinting into the pre-dawn gloom, trying to understand what had agitated them. Then he heard it, a low, distant thrum. At first he thought it was just the blood pounding in his ears. But as it grew louder, hope bloomed in his chest. It was the unmistakable sound of a boat engine. "Here!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm here!" He fumbled for the flare gun, his hands shaking as he loaded it. Pointing it straight up, he pulled the trigger. The flare shot into the sky, illuminating the night with a bright red glow. As the flare's light faded, Jack held his breath, straining his eyes and ears. The engine sound was definitely closer now. Then, like a miracle, a beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the waves. "Here! Over here!" Jack yelled, waving his arms frantically. The light found him, momentarily blinding him. As his eyes adjusted, he made out the shape of a Coast Guard cutter approaching. Tears of relief streamed down Jack's face as he realized that rescue was finally at hand. But his elation was short-lived. The orcas, which had been a constant presence for the past 2 days, were now nowhere to be seen. As the Coast Guard boat drew nearer, Jack scanned the waters, a strange mix of relief and unease washing over him. Just as the rescue boat was about to reach him, a massive shape breached the surface nearby. The lead orca, its black and white body glistening in the spotlight, seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Its eye met Jack's one last time, and in that gaze Jack saw something he couldn't quite define, a mixture of intelligence, curiosity, and perhaps even a grudging respect. Then the orca crashed back into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves along with the rest of its pod. As hands reached down to pull Jack to safety, he found himself staring at the spot where the orca had vanished, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. The ordeal was over, but Jack Thornton knew that the mystery of those 2 days at sea would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the Coast Guard cutter turned towards shore, Jack clutched the piece of the Sea Whisper to his chest, a tangible reminder of an experience that defied explanation. The Coast Guard cutter sliced through the choppy waters, its engines humming steadily as it made its way back to shore. Jack Thornton sat wrapped in blankets on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon where his ordeal had unfolded. The piece of the Sea Whisper lay in his lap, his fingers tracing the worn wood absently. "Mr. Thornton?" A young Coast Guard officer approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Ensign Miller. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened out there." Jack nodded slowly, his throat still raw from dehydration and exposure. "Of course," he croaked. Miller sat down across from Jack, pen poised over his notepad. "Can you walk me through the events leading up to your distress call?" Jack took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his salt-burned lungs. "I left Juneau 2 days ago for a routine fishing trip. The weather was clear when I set out, but a fog rolled in that evening. That's when—" He trailed off, the memory of that first impact still vivid in his mind. "That's when what, Mr. Thornton?" Miller prompted gently. "That's when they attacked," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Miller's brow furrowed. "They? Who attacked you, sir?" Jack met the young officer's eyes, seeing the skepticism there. "Orcas, a pod of them. They came out of nowhere, started ramming my boat." Miller's pen hesitated over the paper. "Orcas, sir? Are you sure? I've been fishing these waters for 40 years, son," Jack replied, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "I know what I saw." The ensign nodded, jotting down notes. "And they deliberately attacked your boat?" Jack closed his eyes, remembering the coordinated assaults, the intelligence in those dark eyes. "Yes, it wasn't random. They knew exactly what they were doing." As Miller continued his questioning, Jack recounted the sinking of the Sea Whisper, his time adrift in the life raft, and the orcas' strange behavior. With each detail, the young officer's expression grew more troubled. "Mr. Thornton," Miller said carefully, "I have to tell you, what you're describing. It's unprecedented. Orcas don't attack boats, at least not like this." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't know that? I've seen plenty of orcas in my day. Never anything like this." A commotion on the other side of the deck drew their attention. A group of Coast Guard personnel were clustered around a computer screen, talking excitedly. "Excuse me for a moment," Miller said, rising to join his colleagues. Left alone, Jack turned his gaze back to the sea. The sun was climbing higher, now burning away the last wisps of morning fog. Somewhere out there, the orcas were continuing their mysterious journey. Despite everything, Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe at their power and intelligence. Miller returned, his face pale. "Mr. Thornton, I owe you an apology. We've just received reports from other vessels in the area. There have been multiple sightings of unusually aggressive orca behavior in the past 48 hours. Jack felt a mix of vindication and unease. "Any idea why?" The ensign shook his head. Nothing concrete. Some are speculating about changes in ocean temperatures, others about disruptions to their food supply. But honestly, sir, we're at a loss. As they neared the coast, Jack could see a small crowd gathered at the dock. News of his rescue must have spread quickly. Among the onlookers, he spotted a familiar face, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist he'd worked with in the past. The moment the boat docked, Elena pushed her way through the crowd. "Jack, thank God you're all right." Jack managed a weak smile as he was helped off the boat. "Takes more than a few ornery whales to do me in, Elena." Elena's face grew serious. "Jack, I need to know everything that happened out there, every detail." Before Jack could respond, a pair of paramedics approached with a stretcher. "Sir, we need to get you to the hospital for a checkup." Jack waved them off. "I'm fine. Just need some rest and a hot meal." "Jack," Elena insisted, "this is important. What you experienced could be crucial to understanding what's happening out there." Looking into Elena's earnest face, Jack felt the weight of his experience settle on him anew. He nodded slowly. "All right, but not here. Too many years." Elena helped Jack through the crowd, fielding questions from concerned locals and pushy reporters. They made their way to her small office. At the local Marine Research Center, a cluttered space filled with books, charts, and various specimens in jars. As Jack sank into a chair, Elena handed him a bottle of water. "Drink this, slowly." Jack took a grateful sip, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "Thanks." Elena pulled up a chair across from him, a recorder in her hand. "Do you mind if I record this? It could be invaluable data." Jack nodded his assent and Elena pressed the record button. "All right, Jack, start from the beginning." For the next hour, Jack recounted his ordeal in painstaking detail. He described the initial attack, the sinking of the Sea Whisper, and his time adrift. He spoke of the orcas' coordinated movements, their seemingly deliberate actions, and the strange moment when they appeared to feed him. Elena listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Jack finished, she sat back, her face a mask of concern and fascination. "Jack, what you're describing, it's extraordinary. Orcas are intelligent, yes, but this level of coordinated behavior towards a human, it's unheard of." Jack leaned forward, his voice low. "Elena, there was something else. Something I didn't tell the Coast Guard." Elena's eyebrows raised. "What is it?" "When they were circling my raft, I could have sworn—" Jack hesitated, aware of how it would sound. "I could have sworn they were trying to communicate." Elena's eyes widened. "Communicate? How?" Jack shook his head, frustrated. "I don't know. It wasn't just their calls. It was the way they moved, the way they looked at me, like they were trying to tell me something." Elena was silent for a long moment, her mind clearly racing. "Jack, I know this is a lot to ask, but I need you to come with me to the lab. We have some new equipment. It might help us make sense of what happened out there." Jack hesitated. Every fiber of his being wanted nothing more than to go home, to try and forget the terror of the past 2 days. But the memory of those intelligent eyes, of the orcas' strange behavior, nagged at him. "All right," he said finally. "But after this, I'm going home and sleeping for a week." Elena managed a small smile. "Deal." As they made their way to the lab, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his ordeal was far from over. The mystery of the orcas' behavior loomed large, a puzzle that defied easy explanation. And somewhere out in the vast expanse of the Alaskan waters, a pod of killer whales continued their inscrutable journey, leaving in their wake a trail of questions that would challenge everything humans thought they knew about these magnificent creatures. Jack Thornton, seasoned fisherman and survivor, found himself at the center of a mystery that would ripple through the scientific community and beyond. As he followed Elena into the sterile confines of the lab, he couldn't help but feel that he was standing on the threshold of something much larger than himself, a shift in the delicate balance between man and nature, with consequences that were yet to be understood. The sterile fluorescent lights of the Marine Research Lab cast a harsh glow over Jack Thornton's weathered face as he sat before a bank of computer screens. Dr. Elena Vasquez bustled around him, adjusting equipment and muttering to herself. The adrenaline that had kept Jack going was starting to wear off. leaving him feeling every one of his 60 years, and then some. "Elena," Jack said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "what exactly are we doing here?" Elena paused in her work, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "We're going to analyze the ORCA vocalizations you heard. If we're lucky, we might be able to decipher some meaning from them." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You think we can understand what they were saying?" "Not exactly," Elena replied, her eyes bright with scientific excitement. "But orcas have complex communication systems. Different pods even have their own dialects. If we can identify patterns in their vocalizations during your encounter, it might give us some insight into their behavior." As Elena worked, Jack's mind wandered back to those terrifying hours at sea. The memory of the orca's haunting call sent a shiver down his spine. "All right, Jack," Elena said, pulling him back to the present. "I need you to listen to these recordings and tell me if any of them sound similar to what you heard." She pressed a button, and a series of clicks, whistles, and haunting moans filled the lab. Jack closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him. Some were familiar, the typical calls he'd heard from orcas over his years at sea. But then, "Wait," Jack said, his eyes snapping open. "Play that last one again." Elena obliged, and the eerie, multi-toned call echoed through the room. Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what I heard right before they attacked the Sea Whisper." Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up spectrograms and data charts. "This is fascinating," she murmured. "This vocalization doesn't match any known orca dialects in our database." "What does that mean?" Jack asked, leaning forward. "It could mean we're dealing with a pod that hasn't been extensively studied," Elena said slowly. Or what?" Elena hesitated, then met Jack's eyes. "Or we're witnessing a significant change in orca behavior and communication." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Jack rubbed his face, feeling the weight of his experience pressing down on him. "Elena," he said quietly, "what's happening out there?" Before she could answer, the lab door burst open. A young research assistant rushed in, out of breath and clutching a tablet. "Dr. Vasquez," he gasped, "you need to see this." Elena took the tablet, her eyes widening as she scrolled through whatever was on the screen. "My God," she breathed. "What is it?" Jack demanded, rising from his chair. Elena looked up, her face pale. "There have been more attacks. 3 fishing boats and a small whale-watching vessel, all within the last 6 hours. Jack felt his knees go weak. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "Where?" "All along the coast," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. "From here to Sitka," the research assistant, still catching his breath, added. "The Coast Guard's issuing warnings to all vessels. They're advising everyone to stay in port until further notice." Jack's mind raced. This was no isolated incident. Whatever had driven the orcas to attack his boat was spreading. "We need to go back out there," he said suddenly. Elena looked at him in disbelief. "Jack, you can't be serious. You nearly died out there." "Exactly," Jack insisted. "I survived. I saw how they behaved up close. Maybe I can help figure out what's going on." Elena shook her head. "It's too dangerous. We don't know enough about what's causing this behavior, and we won't learn more by sitting in this lab," Jack argued. He could feel a fire kindling in his chest, burning away the fatigue and fear. "Elena, you said it yourself. This is unprecedented. We have a chance to understand something extraordinary." Elena bit her lip, clearly torn between scientific curiosity and concern for Jack's safety. "Even if I agreed, how would we do it? The Coast Guard's not letting anyone out." Jack allowed himself a small, grim smile. "I might know a few old salts who'd be willing to bend the rules for the sake of science." For a long moment, Elena studied Jack's face. Then, with a sigh of resignation, she nodded. "All right. But we do this my way. Full safety protocols. Constant communication with the shore. And at the first sign of danger, we come back. Deal?" "Deal," Jack agreed, feeling a surge of nervous energy. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Elena assembled a small team of researchers and enough equipment to turn a modest fishing boat into a floating laboratory. Jack, true to his word, managed to convince an old friend to lend them his boat. a sturdy vessel named the Northern Light. As they loaded the last of the gear onto the Northern Light, Jack found himself staring out at the choppy waters of the bay. The sun was setting, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of evening that had always filled him with a sense of peace and possibility. Now, it felt like the calm before a storm. Having second thoughts? Elena's voice came from behind him. Jack turned to face her. "No," he said firmly. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared." Elena nodded, her face solemn. "We all are. But what we might learn out there, it could change everything we think we know about orcas, about marine ecology, about our relationship with the ocean itself." Jack managed a wry smile. "No pressure then." Elena laughed, a sound that helped ease some of the tension in Jack's chest. "Come on, old man. Let's go make some waves in the scientific community." As they cast off, Jack took his place at the helm. The familiar vibration of the engine and the smell of salt air brought back a lifetime of memories. But this time, as they headed out into the gathering darkness, Jack felt like he was sailing into uncharted waters in more ways than one. The research team bustled around the deck, setting up hydrophones and other monitoring equipment. Elena stood at Jack's side, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Jack," she said softly, "whatever happens out there, thank you for doing this. Your experience, your insights, they're invaluable." Jack nodded, his hand steady on the wheel. "Just promise me one thing, Elena." "What's that?" "If we don't make it back, make sure they don't paint me as some foolish old fisherman who should have known better. Make sure they understand why. We're out here." Elena placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "We're coming back, Jack. And when we do, you'll be able to tell your own story." As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge, Jack Thornton steered the Northern Light deeper into the Gulf of Alaska. Somewhere out there, a pod of orcas was rewriting everything humans thought they knew about these magnificent creatures. And Jack, against all odds and common sense, was sailing out to meet them once again. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the hum of scientific equipment created a surreal atmosphere on the boat. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were balanced on the edge of something momentous, a discovery that could change the way humans understood their place in the natural world. As the darkness of the Alaskan night enveloped them, Jack sent up a silent prayer, not for safety but for the wisdom to understand whatever it was they were about to encounter. The Northern Light cut through the inky darkness of the Alaskan waters, its engine a low hum beneath the lapping of waves against the hull. Jack Thornton stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with a mixture of determination and trepidation. The boat's deck was a hive of activity as Dr. Elena Vasquez and her team of researchers bustled about, adjusting equipment and monitoring readings. "How much further, Jack?" Elena called out, her voice carrying over the sound of the wind and waves. Jack squinted at the navigation equipment, the soft glow of the screens casting an eerie light on his face. "We're approaching the coordinates where I first encountered the pod. Should be there in about 20 minutes. Elena nodded, turning to her team. "All right, everyone. Final equipment check. I want those hydrophones deployed the moment we're in position." As the researchers scrambled to comply, Jack felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The memory of his last encounter with the orcas was still fresh, the terror of those moments etched into his very bones. Yet here he was, willingly sailing back into harm's way. He shook his head, wondering not for the first time if he'd finally lost his mind after all these years at sea. Second thoughts? Elena's voice startled him out of his reverie. She had approached silently, now standing at his side, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Jack managed a wry smile. "About 1,000 of them. But it's a bit late to turn back now, isn't it?" Elena placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly comforting. "We're making history here, Jack. Whatever we discover tonight could change everything we thought we knew about orca behavior. Let's just hope we live to tell about it," Jack muttered. As they neared the coordinates, an eerie calm settled over the boat. The chatter of the research team died down, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the beeping of equipment and the ever-present sound of the sea. "Cut the engine," Elena ordered. "Let's drift from here." Jack complied, and the sudden absence of the engine's rumble made the night seem even more oppressive. The northern light bobbed gently on the waves, surrounded by a vast emptiness that seemed to press in from all sides. "Hydrophones deployed," one of the researchers called out. "Beginning acoustic monitoring now." Elena moved to the bank of computers set up on the deck, her eyes scanning the readouts. "All right, people, eyes and ears open. Report anything unusual, no matter how small." Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Jack found himself straining his eyes against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement in the water. The piece of the sea whisper he'd salvaged sat in his pocket, a talisman against the unknown. Suddenly, one of the younger researchers let out a gasp. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm picking up something on the long-range sensors." Elena rushed to his side, leaning over to examine the screen. Her eyes widened. "My God," she breathed. "It's them." Jack felt his heart rate spike. "Where?" he demanded, moving to join them. The researcher pointed to a cluster of blips on the screen. "About 2 miles out, moving fast, they're heading straight for us." A flurry of activity erupted on the deck as the team prepared for the approaching pod. Jack returned to the helm, ready to maneuver if necessary. His palms were sweaty on the wheel, his mouth dry with anticipation and fear. "Jack," Elena called out, her voice tense. "Remember, at the first sign of aggression, we're out of here, no heroics." Jack nodded grimly. Understood. The minutes that followed were some of the longest of Jack's life. The blips on the screen drew steadily closer, and soon the unmistakable sound of ORCA vocalizations filled the air, picked up by the hydrophones and broadcast through speakers on the deck. "My God," one of the researchers whispered. "I've never heard anything like this." The calls were unlike anything Jack had encountered in his decades at sea. There was a complexity to them, an almost musical quality that sent shivers down his spine. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "They're trying to communicate," Elena said, her voice filled with awe. "These vocalizations, they're not just random calls. There's a pattern here." Before anyone could respond, a massive dorsal fin broke the surface of the water no more than 50 yards from the boat. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the distinctive shape. It was the lead orca from his previous encounter. "Nobody move," Elena ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let them come to us." The orca circled the boat slowly, its movements deliberate and graceful. More fins appeared, until the northern light was surrounded by the pod. Jack counted at least a dozen animals, their sleek bodies gliding effortlessly through the water. For several long moments nothing happened. The orcas continued to circle, their movements synchronized in a mesmerizing dance. Then, without warning, the lead orca approached the boat. "Jack," Elena said, her voice tight with tension. "Whatever you do, don't make any sudden moves." Jack stood frozen at the helm, his heart pounding in his chest as the massive creature drew closer. He could see its eye now, fixed on him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. In that moment, Jack felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of connection. The orca surfaced right next to the boat, close enough that Jack could have reached out and touched it. Its blowhole expelled a misty breath, the sound loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the deck. And then, to everyone's astonishment, the orca began to vocalize. It wasn't the haunting, distant calls they'd heard earlier. This was directed, intentional, as if the creature was trying to speak directly to them. "Elena?" Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" Elena shook her head, her eyes wide with wonder. "I don't know. This is unprecedented. It's almost as if..." She trailed off as the orca's calls changed, becoming more complex, more insistent. The other members of the pod joined in, creating a symphony of sounds that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. Jack felt something in his pocket grow warm. With trembling hands, he pulled out the piece of the sea whisper. To his amazement, it was glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the orca's vocalizations. "Elena," he called out, holding up the piece of wood. "Look at this." Elena rushed to his side, her scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her caution. She stared at the glowing wood, then back at the orcas, her mind clearly racing. The Resonance, she muttered. It's responding to their calls, but how? Her words were cut off as the lead orca surged forward, its massive body half out of the water. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack thought it was going to crash into the boat, but instead, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of gleaming teeth, and something else. Nestled on its tongue was a small, glowing object. It looked almost like a pearl, but it pulsed with the same ethereal light as the peace of the sea whisper. Jack, Elena breathed, her voice filled with awe and confusion. I think they're trying to give us something. Time seemed to stand still as Jack stared at the offered object. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to get as far from these unpredictable creatures as possible. But something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, urged him forward. With a deep breath, Jack reached out. His hand trembled as it neared the orca's open mouth. He could feel the creature's hot breath on his skin, see the intelligence burning in its eye. And then, with a gentleness that belied its massive size, the orca deposited the glowing object into Jack's palm. The moment his fingers closed around it, a jolt of energy surged through Jack's body. Images flashed through his mind. Vast underwater canyons, schools of fish moving in intricate patterns, and something else. Something ancient and powerful, sleeping in the depths. Jack stumbled backward, gasping for air. Elena caught him, her face a mask of concern and excitement. Jack, what happened? What is it? He looked down at the object in his hand, then back at the orca. The creature had retreated slightly, but its gaze remained fixed on Jack. I'm not sure. Jack managed, his voice hoarse. But I think they're asking for our help. Elena's eyes widened. Help? With what? Before Jack could respond, the water around the boat began to churn. The orcas were moving, their bodies sleek torpedoes cutting through the waves. But they weren't attacking. Instead, they seemed to be hurting the boat. They want us to follow them, Jack said, a certainty he couldn't explain filling his voice. Elena hesitated for just a moment before nodding. Do it, she said. Whatever's happening here, we need to see it through. Jack turned to the helm, firing up the engine. As the northern light began to move, following the pod of orcas into the unknown, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental. Whatever lay ahead, whatever mystery these magnificent creatures were trying to reveal, Jack knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The glowing object pulsed warmly in his hand, a beacon guiding them into uncharted waters. As the familiar coastline faded into the distance, Jack Thornton, lifelong fisherman and reluctant explorer, steered into the heart of a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the natural world and humanity's place within. The night stretched on, filled with the sound of crashing waves, the hum of the engine, and the haunting calls of the orcas. Whatever dawn would bring, Jack knew that the world was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. And somehow, improbably, he found himself at the center of it all. The northern light plowed through the choppy waters, guided by the sleek forms of the orca pod. Jack Thornton's weathered hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting. Between the navigation equipment and the dark shapes moving effortlessly through the waves ahead, the glowing object the lead orca had given him pulsed warmly in his pocket. A constant reminder of the bizarre turn his life had taken. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood beside him, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Jack, we're heading into some seriously deep water, she said, studying the depth readings. We're approaching the edge of the continental shelf. Jack nodded grimly. I know these waters, Elena. We're going where few fishing boats ever venture. Whatever they want to show us, it's out there in the deep. The research team bustled about the deck, adjusting equipment and taking readings. The air was thick with tension and the scent of salt spray. One of the younger researchers, a grad student named Mike, approached Elena with a tablet in hand. Dr. Vasquez, you need to see this, he said, his voice trembling slightly. The acoustic readings we're getting, they're off the charts. Elena took the tablet, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the data. This can't be right, she muttered. These frequencies, they're not just orca vocalizations. There's something else out there. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, something else? Before Elena could answer, the lead orca breached spectacularly just ahead of the boat. Its massive body cleared the water entirely, hanging in the air for a moment before crashing back down with a thunderous splash. "My God," Elena breathed. "They're trying to tell us something." As if in response, the glowing object in Jack's pocket grew warmer. He pulled it out, marveling at how it seemed to pulse in time with the orca's movements. "Elena," he said, holding it out to her, "what do you make of this?" She took it carefully, turning it over in her hands. "I've never seen anything like it. It's almost as if it's alive somehow." Suddenly, the boat's radar began to beep insistently. Mike rushed to check the readouts, his face paling. "Dr. Vasquez, there's something massive coming up from below us." Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. "Everybody hold on," he shouted, preparing to maneuver. The sea around them began to churn violently. The orcas dove, disappearing beneath the turbulent surface. For a moment, an eerie calm settled over the boat. Then, with a sound that seemed to shake the very air around them, the water exploded, upward. A shape rose from the depths, so large that at first Jack's mind couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. "It can't be," Elena whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. As the water cascaded off the massive form, Jack realized he was looking at the largest creature he had ever seen. It dwarfed the boat, making the northern light seem like a tiny toy in comparison. Its skin was a mottled gray, covered in strange bioluminescent patterns that pulsed and shifted. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of water rushing off the creature's enormous body. Elena shook her head, at a loss for words. It's not like anything in the fossil record. This shouldn't be possible." The creature's head rose from the water, revealing eyes the size of car tires. They were filled with an intelligence that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. This was no mindless beast. There was something ancient and knowing in that gaze. The orcas resurfaced, swimming around the giant creature in what almost looked like a protective formation. The lead orca approached the boat once more, its eyes fixed on Jack. Without fully understanding why, Jack found himself reaching out towards the massive creature. The glowing object in his hand pulsed brightly, and suddenly, his mind was filled with images and sensations. He saw vast underwater cities teeming with life forms he couldn't begin to comprehend. He felt the weight of millennia, the slow turning of the earth and the shifting of continents. And through it all, he sensed a deep, abiding connection to the sea and all its creatures. When the vision faded, Jack stumbled back, gasping for air. Elena caught him, her face etched with concern. "Jack, what happened? What did you see?" Jack struggled to find words to describe the experience. They're not just animals, Elena. The orcas, this leviathan, they're guardians, protectors of the ocean." Elena's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence of her own eyes. "Protectors? But why reveal themselves now? Why to us?" As if in answer, the giant creature began to move. Its massive body shifted, revealing something clutched against its side. At first, Jack thought it was some kind of growth or parasite, but as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse, "that's a submarine. A human submarine." Elena squinted into the darkness, then gasped as she realized Jack was right. Held gently but firmly against the creature's flank was a submarine, its hull dented and scarred. "It can't be," she muttered. "The Navy hasn't reported any missing vessels." Jack's mind raced. Maybe it's not one of ours. Maybe it's... He trailed off as the implications hit him. If this was a foreign submarine, operating secretly in Alaskan waters, it could mean an international incident. But more than that, it could explain the orca's recent aggressive behavior towards surface vessels. The lead orca surfaced near the boat again, its eye fixed on Jack. In that moment, he understood. "They're not attacking us," he said slowly. "They're defending their territory. Against us." Elena looked from Jack to the submarine, her face a mask of realization and horror. Oh my God. If that sub was conducting some kind of unauthorized operation out here, then the orcas were the first line of defense, Jack finished. And now they're showing us the real threat. The massive creature let out a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the very hull of the Northern Light. The orcas responded with a chorus of calls, creating a symphony unlike anything Jack had ever heard. "They're asking for our help," Jack said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "They can't just destroy the sub. That would risk all-out war. But they can't let it go either." Elena ran a hand through her hair, her scientific worldview crumbling in the face of what she was witnessing. This is beyond anything we ever imagined. If what you're saying is true, then these creatures are more than just animals. They're sentient, intelligent beings with a complex society and sense of ethics. Jack nodded, his mind still reeling from the implications. "And they've been here all along, watching us, protecting the oceans from our worst impulses." The glowing object in Jack's hand pulsed once more, and he felt a sense of urgency wash over him. "We need to contact the authorities," he said, "but we have to be careful. If word of this gets out before we're ready..." Elena nodded grimly. "It could cause panic, or worse, it could lead to people trying to exploit these creatures." Jack turned to the helm, his decision made. "We're heading back to port. Elena, get on the secure line to your contacts in the government. We need to set up a meeting with people who can handle this situation discreetly." As the northern light began to turn, the giant creature and its orca guardians began to sink beneath the waves. The last thing Jack saw before they disappeared was the eye of the lead orca, meeting his gaze one final time. In that look, he saw not just intelligence, but a profound hope. Hope that humanity would finally understand the true nature of the oceans and the beings that called them home. As they sailed back towards the coast, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon. Jack Thornton, lifelong fisherman turned reluctant diplomat between two worlds, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Whatever came next, he knew that the relationship between humanity and the sea would never be the same again. The oceans had shared their secret, and now it was up to them to prove worthy of that trust. The northern light cut through the early morning mist as it approached the bustling port of Juneau. Jack Thornton stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with a tension that belied the calm waters. The events of the night weighed heavily on his mind, each crashing wave a reminder of the incredible secret they now carried. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from below deck, dark circles under her eyes, testament to a sleepless night spent analyzing data and making encrypted calls. "Any luck?" Jack asked, his voice gruff with exhaustion. Elena nodded, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "I've arranged a meeting with some high-level officials. They'll be waiting for us at a secure location in the city." Jack grunted, in acknowledgement, his eyes never leaving the approaching shoreline. "And they understand the gravity of what we're bringing them, as much as they can, without seeing it for themselves," Elena replied. "I had to be careful about how much I..." revealed over the comm lines. As they neared the dock, Jack noticed an unusual amount of activity for the early hour. Men in dark suits milled about, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the dim light. "Looks like our welcoming committee," Jack muttered. Elena's brow furrowed. "I don't like this, Jack. There are more of them than I expected." Before Jack could respond, a voice crackled over the radio. "Northern Light, this is Port Authority. You are ordered to dock at Pier 7. Do not deviate from this instruction." Jack exchanged a worried glance with Elena before responding. "Understood, Port Authority," proceeding to Pier 7. As they maneuvered into the designated berth, Jack could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. The moment the boat was secured, a group of stern-faced men in suits approached. A tall, imposing figure stepped forward. "Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Thornton, I'm Agent Caldwell. We need you to come with us immediately." Elena bristled at the man's tone. "Now wait just a minute. We agreed to a meeting, not an interrogation. Where are the scientific advisors I was promised?" Caldwell's expression remained impassive. "All in good time, Doctor. But first we need to debrief you in a secure location." Jack stepped between Elena and the agent, his voice low and dangerous. "Listen here, son. We've just been through hell and back to bring you information that could change the course of history. You'd do well to show a little respect." For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Then, almost imperceptibly, Caldwell's posture softened. "My apologies, Mr. Thornton. You're right, of course. If you'll both follow me, we have a car waiting to take us to the meeting site." As they were ushered into a black SUV with tinted windows, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake. The glowing object in his pocket seemed to pulse in agreement, its warmth a constant reminder of the incredible responsibility they now bore. The drive through Juneau's streets was silent and tense. Elena clutched her tablet, filled with data from their encounter, while Jack's hand remained in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the mysterious artifact. Finally, they pulled up to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. Caldwell led them through a series of security checkpoints before ushering them into a conference room where a group of serious-looking individuals waited. An older man with salt and pepper hair stood as they entered. "Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Thornton, thank you for coming. I'm Admiral Hawthorne. I understand you have some unusual information for us." Elena stepped forward, her scientific training kicking in despite her apprehension. "Admiral, what we witnessed last night defies explanation by any conventional means. We have evidence of a level of cetacean intelligence and organization that goes far beyond anything previously documented." She proceeded to lay out their findings, presenting data from their equipment and recounting the incredible encounter with the massive unknown creature. As she spoke, Jack watched the faces of those assembled, noting the mix of skepticism, wonder, and in some cases, poorly concealed fear. When Elena finished, Admiral Hawthorne leaned forward, his expression grave. "And you believe these creatures were communicating with you, asking for help?" Jack cleared his throat. "It's more than that, sir. They showed us something. A submarine hidden in the depths. One that doesn't belong to us." A murmur ran through the room. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that a foreign power has been conducting unauthorized operations in our waters?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Elena interjected. "And more importantly, these creatures, the orcas and this Leviathan, they've been protecting our waters. They're not just animals, Admiral. They're sentient beings with a complex society and a deep connection to the oceans." A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, a woman in a crisp naval uniform spoke up. "With all due respect, Doctor, this sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. Do you have any concrete evidence to support these claims?" Jack felt a surge of anger at the dismissive tone, but before he could speak, the object in his pocket grew almost unbearably hot. Without thinking, he pulled it out, holding it up for all to see. The reaction was immediate. Several of the officials recoiled while others leaned in, eyes wide with fascination. The object pulsed with an otherworldly light, casting strange shadows across the room. "My God," Hawthorne breathed. "What is that?" "We don't know," Jack admitted. "But it was given to us by the orcas, and when I touch it I can see things, understand things that I shouldn't be able to." As if on cue, the object flared brightly. Jack gasped as his mind was once again flooded with images. Vast underwater realms, creatures beyond imagination, and a sense of ancient wisdom and deep concern for the fate of the oceans. When the vision faded, Jack found himself on his knees, Elena's steady hand on his shoulder. The room had erupted into chaos, with officials arguing loudly and Caldwell barking orders into a comm unit. Admiral Hawthorne's voice cut through the din. "Enough, Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Thornton. I think it's clear that we're dealing with something far beyond our current understanding. We'll need to assemble a task force immediately to investigate this further and determine our next steps." Elena helped Jack to his feet, her voice firm as she addressed the Admiral. "With all due respect, sir, we don't have time for bureaucratic red tape. These creatures reached out to us for a reason. They're asking for our help, and if we don't act quickly, we risk losing their trust forever." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "You're right, of course, but we can't simply ignore protocol, especially with the potential international implications of that submarine." Jack, still reeling from the vision, found his voice. "Then let us go back out there. Elena and her team. With proper support and resources, we've established a connection with these beings. Let us be the bridge between our worlds." The room fell silent as Hawthorne considered the proposal. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed. We'll provide you with a research vessel and a small naval escort. But understand this. What you've discovered could change the course of human history. The fate of our relationship with the oceans, perhaps with our entire planet, may rest on what happens next." As the meeting adjourned and plans were hastily made for their return to sea, Jack found himself staring out a window at the vast Alaskan wilderness. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but alongside it was a sense of wonder and purpose he hadn't felt in years. Elena joined him, her face a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Are you ready for this, Jack? There's no going back once we set sail." Jack turned to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Elena, I've spent my entire life on the sea. I thought I knew her secrets, her moods, her dangers. But now I feel like we're about to truly understand her for the first time." As they left the building, preparing to embark on a journey that would redefine humanity's relationship with the ocean, Jack felt the artifact pulse warmly in his pocket. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever wonders or terrors they might face, he knew that they were on the cusp of something truly extraordinary. The sea, it seemed, had many more secrets to share, and Jack Thornton was ready to listen. The research vessel Oceanic Explorer cut through the choppy Alaskan waters, its hull vibrating with the power of its engines. Jack Thornton stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he scanned the horizon. The familiar scent of salt spray filled his nostrils, but the knot in his stomach was anything but familiar. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest. "Any sign of them?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Jack shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they'll come. I can feel it." As if in response to his words, the artifact in his pocket pulsed warmly. Jack had refused to let the government scientist study it, insisting that it was a gift meant for him alone. Now, as they neared the coordinates of their previous encounter, he could sense its energy growing stronger. The bridge door opened, and Admiral Hawthorne stepped out, his face grim. "Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Thornton, we've picked up some unusual sonar readings. I think you should take a look." They followed him to the ship's advanced sonar station, where a young technician was staring at her screen with wide eyes. "What are we looking at, Ensign?" Hawthorne asked. The technician swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm not entirely sure. These readings, they don't make sense. It's as if the ocean floor is moving." Elena leaned in, her scientific curiosity piqued. "Can you amplify the signal?" As the technician adjusted the settings, a series of low, haunting tones filled the room. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He recognized those sounds. "It's them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're calling us." Admiral Hawthorne turned to Jack, his expression a mixture of skepticism and wonder. "Mr. Thornton, are you saying you can understand these noises?" Before Jack could respond, the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared as crew members scrambled to their stations. "What the hell was that?" Hawthorne demanded. The helmsman's voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir, we've lost propulsion. Something's caught in the screws." Jack and Elena exchanged a knowing look. "They're here," Elena said. As if on cue, a massive dorsal fin broke the surface of the water off the ship's port side. The ORCA, larger than any Jack had ever seen, seemed to stare directly at him through the bridge windows. "My God," Hawthorne breathed. "It's really them." Jack felt the artifact in his pocket grow almost unbearably hot. Without thinking, he pulled it out, holding it up towards the ORCA. The gem-like object pulsed with an otherworldly light, and suddenly Jack's mind was flooded with images and sensations. He saw vast underwater canyons teeming with life, felt the vibrations of the Earth's core, and sensed a deep, ancient intelligence that defied human comprehension. When the vision faded, he found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. Elena was at his side in an instant. "Jack, what happened? What did you see?" Jack struggled to find words to describe the experience. They're showing us their world, the true nature of the oceans. It's beyond anything we could have imagined." Admiral Hawthorne helped Jack to his feet, his skepticism replaced by a look of awe. "Mr. Thornton, I think it's time you tell us exactly what that object is and how it's connected to these creatures." Jack nodded, still reeling from the vision. "It's a key, Admiral. A key to understanding their world, their language. And they've chosen us to receive it." As Jack spoke, more orcas surfaced around the ship. The crew watched in amazement as The massive creatures began to move in synchronized patterns, their bodies creating intricate designs in the water. Elena's eyes widened as she studied the patterns. "It's not random," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Look at the way they're moving. It's a language. A visual language." Jack felt the artifact pulse again, and suddenly he could see it too. The orca's movements weren't just beautiful, they were meaningful. Each twist and turn conveyed complex ideas and emotions. "They're telling us a story," Jack said, his voice filled with wonder. "The story of their world, and our place in it." As the orcas continued their mesmerizing dance, the water around the ship began to churn. A collective gasp went up from the crew as an enormous shape began to rise from the depths. The Leviathan, the same creature they had encountered before, breached the surface with a sound that shook the very air around them. Its massive body dwarfed the research vessel, making it seem like a toy in comparison. Admiral Hawthorne's face paled. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered. "What is that thing?" Jack stepped forward, the artifact glowing brightly in his hand. "It's not a thing, Admiral, it's a being, ancient and wise beyond our comprehension, and it's here to show us something." As if in response to Jack's words, the Leviathan's enormous eye focused on the ship. In that gaze, Jack saw millennia of knowledge, a deep connection to the very essence of the planet, and a profound concern for the future. The artifact pulsed once more, and Jack understood. "The submarine," he said. "They're going to show us the submarine." Sure enough, the Leviathan began to move, its massive body cutting through the water with surprising grace. The orcas followed, creating a protective escort around the ship as it was gently pushed by unseen currents. Elena turned to Admiral Hawthorne, her eyes shining with the thrill of discovery. "Admiral, we need to follow them. Whatever they're about to show us, it's crucial that we see it." Hawthorne hesitated for just a moment before nodding to the helmsman. "Do it. Follow their lead." As the oceanic explorer was guided through the waters by its cetacean escorts, Jack felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. For all his years at sea, he realized he had only scratched the surface of the ocean's true nature. Hours passed as they journeyed deeper into uncharted waters. The crew worked tirelessly, recording every detail of their incredible voyage. Finally, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the Leviathan slowed its pace. "We're here," Jack said, feeling the artifact grow warm in his hand. The massive creature dove beneath the waves, disappearing from sight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very hull of the ship, something began to rise from the depths. Gasps and cries of shock filled the bridge as the object came into view. It was, as Jack had said, a submarine. But it was like no submarine any of them had ever seen. Its sleek, black hull was marked with strange symbols, and its design was far more advanced than anything in any known Navy's arsenal. Admiral Hawthorne's face hardened. "That's not one of ours," he said grimly. "And it's not like anything I've ever seen from any other nation." Elena studied the vessel through binoculars, her scientific mind racing. "The design, the materials, and this technology is decades ahead of anything we have. Maybe even centuries." As they watched, the orcas began to circle the submarine, their movements becoming more agitated. The Leviathan surfaced once more, its massive body positioning itself between the research vessel and the mysterious submarine. Jack felt the artifact pulse urgently in his hand. Images flooded his mind. Visions of the submarine's crew conducting experiments, of damage being done to the delicate underwater ecosystems, of a looming threat that went far beyond mere military posturing. When the vision faded, Jack turned to Admiral Hawthorne, his face grave. "Admiral, we have a bigger problem than unauthorized incursions into our waters. That submarine, it's not from any nation on Earth." A heavy silence fell over the bridge as the implications of Jack's words sank in. They were facing not just a diplomatic crisis, but a potential threat to the entire planet. Elena's voice broke the silence. "The orcas, the Leviathan, they've been protecting us, not just from each other, but from something far beyond our understanding." Admiral Hawthorne's military training warred with the evidence before his eyes. "Are you saying we're dealing with extraterrestrial visitors?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think that's exactly what we're dealing with, Admiral. And our cetacean friends here? They're the Earth's first line of defense. As night fell over the Alaskan waters, the crew of the Oceanic Explorer found themselves at the center of a cosmic drama. The oceans had revealed their greatest secret, and now humanity faced a choice: to embrace their role as partners in protecting their planet, or to continue down a path of ignorance and potential destruction. Jack Thornton, once a simple fisherman, now stood at the crossroads of history. The artifact pulsed in his hand, a beacon of hope and a reminder of the incredible responsibility they now bore. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that the fate of not just the oceans but of all life on Earth hung in the balance. The Oceanic Explorer rocked gently in the calm Alaskan waters, an island of human technology surrounded by nature's most enigmatic guardians. Jack Thornton stood at the bow, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he gazed out at the pod of orcas circling the ship. The artifact in his pocket pulsed warmly, a constant reminder of the incredible responsibility that now rested on their shoulders. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached, her face a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Jack, the team's ready. We're going to attempt communication using the hydrophone array." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the water. "And the submarine? Still there?" Elena replied, her voice tight. "The Leviathan is keeping it pinned to the seafloor. But Jack, we can't keep this quiet much longer. The world needs to know what's happening here." Before Jack could respond, Admiral Hawthorne's voice crackled over the ship's intercom. "Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Thornton, report to the bridge immediately. We've got a situation." They rushed to the bridge, finding it a hive of frantic activity. Hawthorne stood at the center, his face grim as he studied a series of readouts. "What's going on, Admiral?" Jack asked. Hawthorne turned to them, his expression grave. "We've lost contact with Juno. In fact, we're not picking up any signals from the mainland. It's like everything's gone dark." Elena's eyes widened. "Could it be some kind of interference from the submarine?" "That's our working theory," Hawthorne nodded. "But we can't be certain. Whatever's happening, it's big, and it's happening fast." Jack felt the artifact grow hot in his pocket. Without thinking, he pulled it out, holding it up as images flooded his mind. He saw cities plunged into darkness, communication networks failing, and a growing panic spreading across the globe. When the vision faded, he found Elena and Hawthorne staring at him expectantly. "It's not just Alaska," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "It's everywhere. Something's interfering with our technology on a global scale." Hawthorne's face paled. "My God, we're under attack." As if in response to his words, the ship's alarms began to blare. The sonar operator called out, panic evident in his voice. "Sir, the submarine, it's powering up." They rushed to the windows, watching in horror as the sleek black vessel began to rise from the depths. The orcas scattered, their calls filling the air with a cacophony of distress. "We have to stop it," Elena said urgently. "If that thing reaches the surface." Her words were cut off as the Leviathan breached, its massive body crashing down on top of the submarine. The impact sent shockwaves through the water, rocking the Oceanic Explorer violently. "All hands brace for impact," Hawthorne shouted into the intercom. As the crew scrambled to secure themselves, Jack felt the artifact pulse with an urgency he hadn't experienced before. Acting on instinct, he raised it high, focusing all his thoughts on communication, on understanding. Suddenly, the bridge was filled with a piercing, otherworldly sound. The crew clutched their ears in pain, but Jack stood transfixed, his mind opening to a vast, alien consciousness. Images and sensations flooded through him. The history of Earth seen through eyes not human, the delicate balance of ecosystems spanning millennia, and a deep, abiding love for the planet that transcended species. When the sound faded, Jack found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. Elena was at his side in an instant, her face etched with concern. "Jack, what happened? What did you see?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and fear. "They've been here all along, Elena. The orcas, the Leviathan, they're not just animals. They're guardians, protectors of Earth against threats we couldn't even comprehend." Hawthorne stepped forward, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "Are you saying these creatures have been defending us from alien invasion?" Jack nodded slowly. "For longer than we can imagine. But now, they need our help. The threat is evolving, becoming something they can't face alone. As if to punctuate his words, the submarine burst from the water's surface, its hull gleaming with an otherworldly light. The Leviathan roared, a sound so profound it seemed to shake the very air around them. "My God," Elena breathed. "What do we do?" Jack stood, the artifact glowing brightly in his hand. "We fight. Together." He strode to the ship's communication array, the artifact pulsing in time with his heartbeat. As he touched the controls, a surge of energy coursed through the system. Suddenly, the darkened screens came to life, filled with images from around the world. "I don't believe it," Hawthorne muttered. "You've broken through the interference." Jack nodded, his voice filled with a certainty he didn't fully understand. "It's time for humanity to know the truth, to take our place as partners in protecting our world." As they watched, Jack's message began to broadcast across the globe. In every language, on every device still functioning, the truth of Earth's ancient guardians and the threat they now faced was revealed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From every corner of the planet, people began to rally. Scientists offered their expertise. Military forces mobilized to support the orcas and the Leviathan, and ordinary citizens took to the seas in whatever vessels they could find. Elena touched Jack's arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did it, Jack. You bridged the gap between our worlds." But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The alien submarine, now fully emerged, began to emit a high-pitched whine. The water around it started to churn, forming a vortex that grew larger by the second. "It's opening some kind of portal," Elena gasped. Jack felt the artifact grow, almost unbearably hot. He knew with a certainty that transcended understanding what he had to do. "Admiral," he said, turning to Hawthorne, "I need you to get this ship and its crew to safety." Hawthorne's eyes widened as realization dawned. "You're not thinking of—" "It's why I was chosen," Jack said softly. "Why the artifact was given to me. I have to finish this." Elena grabbed his arm, her voice choked with emotion. "Jack, no, there has to be another way." He cupped her face gently, offering a sad smile. "This is the other way, Elena. It's what I was meant to do." Before anyone could stop him, Jack raced to the deck. The artifact pulsed in his hand, guiding him as he dove into the churning waters. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but the artifact's warmth sustained him. He swam towards the vortex, feeling the Leviathan's presence beside him, supporting him. As he neared the submarine, Jack saw the alien craft for what it truly was, a harbinger of destruction, a threat to everything he had ever known and loved. With the last of his strength, he pressed the artifact against the submarine's hull. Energy surged through him, connecting him to the orcas, to the Leviathan, to the very spirit of Earth itself. In that moment, Jack Thornton ceased to be just a man. He became a conduit, a bridge between worlds. The power of the ocean's guardians flowed through him, sealing the portal and enveloping the alien threat. There was a flash of blinding light, a sound that seemed to echo through time itself, and then silence. When the waters calmed, there was no sign of the submarine, the vortex, or Jack Thornton, but in the depths of the ocean, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed his sacrifice, a new understanding had taken root. Humanity had been given a second chance, an opportunity to become true stewards of their planet. And in the songs of the orcas and the ancient wisdom of the Leviathan, the legacy of one brave fisherman would live on, a testament to the extraordinary power of connection, compassion, and the enduring spirit of Earth's true guardians.